Welcome to today's deep exploration into one of the most compelling psychological patterns in modern relationships. Have you ever noticed what shifts inside someone when you finally stop pursuing them? When the messages slow down, the calls disappear, and silence begins to take over. In this discussion, we're going into the psychology of avoidant attachment and what may unfold internally when you choose to fully step back and no longer initiate contact. This is not about revenge or control, but about understanding emotional behavior on a deeper human level. Whether you're healing from a relationship with an avoidant partner, friend, or family member, or simply trying to understand attachment dynamics, this will bring clarity to what silence tends to activate in them. And if you've ever wondered whether they notice your absence or come to understand your value once you're gone, stay with this, because the answer may challenge your expectations. At first, when you stop reaching out, the avoidant person may feel an immediate sense of relief. The emotional pressure they associate with closeness seems to disappear, along with the demands for constant communication, vulnerability, or emotional responsiveness. Distance feels familiar to them, almost like a safe place they can return to. But this sense of ease is temporary. Their attachment pattern is built on a cycle where one person pursues and the other withdraws, creating a controlled connection without full emotional exposure. When you step completely out of that cycle, the pattern collapses. The silence they now experience is no longer the predictable space they were used to. It becomes real absence. Over time, that absence shifts from feeling like freedom to feeling like disconnection. The belief that connection could exist without effort begins to break, and the assumption that you would always remain available starts to fade. Most people misunderstand avoidant attachment. These individuals often don't process emotions instantly the way others do. Instead of experiencing feelings fully in the moment, they tend to suppress, rationalize, and compartmentalize them as a long-term coping strategy. This usually develops from early environments where emotional expression felt unsafe, ignored, or inconsistent. So when you stop reaching out, there is no immediate emotional breakdown. At first, there is only silence and a sense of space. But over time, that space begins to shift. Their defenses slowly loosen, and emotions they buried start surfacing in fragments. It can come through a song, a memory, or a quiet moment alone. They may not connect it all at once, but feelings like appreciation, longing, and even love begin to emerge in delayed waves. What was avoided in connection often returns in absence, and it often feels stronger the longer the silence continues. One of the deepest fears an avoidant person carries, often beneath awareness, is the sense of being insignificant or easily replaceable. Even with their strong appearance of independence, there is still a need to feel valued and meaningful to someone. When you stop reaching out, this hidden insecurity can quietly activate. At first, they may rationalize it, telling themselves they prefer space or that relationships are too much effort anyway. But as time passes, silence begins to raise uncomfortable inner questions. Did I matter? Have they moved on? Was I forgettable? Have I already been replaced? This touches older emotional wounds of feeling either too much or not enough in relationships. Your withdrawal reflects that fear back to them in a direct way. Yet, ironically, it also highlights your importance because you were the one who stayed, tried, and cared despite their distance and emotional unavailability. There is a well-known psychological pattern where value is only fully recognized after loss, and avoidant dynamics add a unique layer to it. When you are present and emotionally available, it can unconsciously trigger their fear of closeness, causing them to focus more on pressure than on connection itself. But when you are gone, that pressure disappears, and their perception begins to change. They start remembering your kindness, patience, humor, and consistency without the emotional discomfort that once blurred it. With time, your memory becomes idealized, and what-if thoughts begin to surface repeatedly. What if they had tried harder? What if they had opened up? What if they had allowed you in instead of pushing you away? In your absence, the relationship becomes polished in their mind, where flaws fade and your value becomes clearer. Ironically, the love they start to imagine is often the same love they once rejected due to fear and emotional unavailability. Perhaps the most important shift that happens when you fully stop reaching out is that the avoidant person is left alone with the results of their behavior, without any emotional cushion or escape route. When you were still present, still checking in, still trying, there was always an easy narrative available to them, that you would eventually return, that the connection wasn't truly over, and that they still had time to deal with things on their own terms. Your consistency unintentionally removed the urgency for change, because there were no real consequences to staying distant. But when you withdraw completely, that safety net disappears. The silence becomes final, not temporary. It quietly communicates that you've chosen yourself and no longer wish to keep investing in one-sided effort. That kind of finality often triggers deeper reflection that surface-level interaction never could. In that space, they may begin confronting uncomfortable questions they have avoided for a long time. Why do I keep pushing away what I say I want? Why do I sabotage relationships when they start to matter? Why does closeness feel threatening even when it's safe? These thoughts can lead to a deeper form of regret, not just missing your presence, but recognizing a repeating pattern of emotional avoidance that has impacted multiple relationships. In some cases, this realization can push them toward genuine inner work, therapy, or self-awareness. In others, it may remain just an insight they never fully act on. Either way, your absence becomes the moment of truth they could avoid before, because you were always there absorbing the impact of their inconsistency. The final shift is in how the dynamic itself changes once you step away for good. The balance of emotional power is no longer tilted toward pursuit and withdrawal. Instead of chasing, you choose distance, and that changes how you are perceived. What once looked like need from you is now replaced by self-respect and boundaries. And even if it is not immediately acknowledged, that shift carries weight. It reflects independence, clarity, and emotional strength. Over time, this often reshapes how they remember you, not as someone who kept returning, but as someone who knew when to leave. However, this recognition does not automatically translate into change or readiness on their part. The most important outcome is internal, not relational. In choosing yourself, you step out of a cycle that required you to overgive, and you reclaim emotional stability that no longer depends on their capacity to meet you halfway. What often gets missed in these dynamics is that absence doesn't just affect the avoidant person emotionally, it disrupts their entire internal structure of relating. Many avoidant individuals are not simply unfeeling or indifferent, they are regulated by distance. Proximity, emotional intensity, and expectation tend to activate their threat system, while space gives them a sense of control and calm. So when you step away completely, you are not just removing yourself as a person, they are losing a regulating pattern they were unconsciously dependent on. Even if that pattern felt uncomfortable, it was familiar, and familiarity often feels safer than uncertainty. This is where the mind starts trying to restore balance, not always through action, but through internal narration. They may replay conversations, reevaluate moments they dismissed at the time, or reinterpret your behavior through a new lens now that emotional pressure is gone. What once felt like too much can start to look like care. What they once minimized can begin to feel meaningful. But this shift is not instant clarity. It's a slow, cognitive, emotional recalibration that happens when the nervous system is no longer activated by proximity. It's also why their realization, if it comes, often feels delayed and fragmented rather than immediate and decisive. At the same time, silence removes something important from them: control over timing. While you were still available, they could engage or withdraw without consequence, keeping emotional distance while still preserving access to connection. When you leave completely, that flexibility disappears. They are no longer able to approach on their own emotional schedule. This can create discomfort, not necessarily because they lost you in a dramatic sense, but because the familiar rhythm they relied on no longer exists. That disruption often triggers reflection, but reflection alone does not guarantee change. Another layer to understand is that avoidant processing is heavily memory-dependent rather than emotion-dependent in real time. This is why longing often appears later, in isolation, when emotional defenses are lower. But memory is selective. It tends to highlight emotional safety, admiration, or attachment moments, while minimizing the reasons distance initially felt necessary. This is how idealization forms. The mind edits the experience to reduce inner conflict. Maybe it wasn't that overwhelming, or maybe I misunderstood what I was feeling. This is not dishonesty as much as psychological self-protection. However, even when reflection deepens, it often collides with identity. For someone who has built a strong sense of self around independence and emotional self-reliance, admitting need, regret, or attachment can feel destabilizing. So instead of fully integrating what they feel, they may oscillate between insight and avoidance again. One moment of clarity is followed by reactivation of old defenses. This is why patterns repeat, even after powerful realizations. From your side, the most important thing to recognize is that silence is not a tool that guarantees awakening in someone else. It is primarily a boundary that reveals reality. It shows you what remains when you stop over-functioning in a connection. If someone is capable of meeting you, they may move toward repair. If they are not, the silence simply exposes that limitation more clearly over time. Either way, what it consistently does is shift you out of uncertainty and into truth, because you are no longer participating in a dynamic that depends on your persistence to exist. Another important layer in all of this is that avoidant attachment is not just about fear of intimacy, it is also about how someone learned to regulate emotional safety. For many avoidant individuals, emotional closeness was once paired with unpredictability, pressure, criticism, or emotional inconsistency. So later in life, even healthy love can unconsciously feel too activating. The nervous system doesn't always differentiate between safe closeness and unsafe closeness. It responds to intensity. That's why distance feels grounding, even if it comes at the cost of connection. When you stop reaching out, the nervous system is no longer being activated by relational demand. But what follows that relief is often a quieter state where buried emotional material begins to surface. Not in a dramatic or cinematic way, but in small interruptions of thought. They might feel fine most of the time, then suddenly experience a wave of memory or emotion that seems disconnected from the present moment. This is one of the reasons avoidant reflection often feels inconsistent. It comes in fragments because their system was trained to shut down emotional processing when it becomes too much. There is also a common misconception that avoidant individuals simply don't care while someone is gone. In reality, many of them care in ways they have difficulty tolerating internally. Caring creates vulnerability, and vulnerability activates discomfort. So the mind quickly tries to reframe or neutralize it. This is where thoughts like, "It wasn't that serious," or "I needed space anyway" can appear. These are not necessarily manipulations. They are stabilizing thoughts that reduce emotional overload. But over time, when external pressure is removed completely, those same defenses can weaken, allowing more honest emotional signals to come through. What often emerges in that space is a form of delayed emotional integration. They begin connecting the emotional meaning of experiences that were previously compartmentalized. For example, they may realize not just that you were good to them, but that your consistency created a level of emotional safety they didn't fully recognize at the time. However, this recognition often comes after the relationship structure has already dissolved, which creates internal conflict. They can see value more clearly when they are no longer required to respond to it. At the same time, absence forces something uncomfortable: self-confrontation without relational distraction. When a connection is active, even if it is unstable, it provides focus. There is something to react to, something to manage, something external to engage with. When it ends, attention turns inward. For avoidant individuals, this inward turn can feel unusually intense because it removes the external buffer that previously helped them avoid deeper emotional layers. That is often when old patterns, earlier attachment wounds, and unresolved relational experiences resurface in a more noticeable way. But it is important to understand that awareness alone does not automatically equal transformation. Someone can recognize their patterns clearly and still fall back into them when triggered again. Real change requires sustained tolerance of emotional discomfort, not just insight. And that is often the hardest part for avoidant systems, staying present long enough with uncomfortable feelings without returning to distance as a form of relief. From your perspective, what matters most is not whether they eventually feel, reflect, or realize your value. What matters is whether the connection required you to consistently shrink your emotional needs to maintain it. Silence often becomes powerful, not because it changes them in a guaranteed way, but because it removes you from a cycle where your presence was used to stabilize something that never stabilized itself. In the end, what all of this really points to is not a dramatic psychological awakening in another person, but a much simpler and more grounded truth about human behavior. People tend to understand the emotional weight of something most clearly when it is no longer shaping their daily experience. Absence creates space, and in that space the mind naturally starts to reinterpret, revisit, and reevaluate what once felt complicated or overwhelming. For someone with avoidant tendencies, that process can be even more delayed or fragmented because their emotional system is built around managing distance as a form of safety. So when that distance becomes permanent, the structure they relied on for emotional regulation is disrupted, and reflection begins to surface in uneven waves rather than a single moment of clarity. But even then, reflection is not the same as resolution. A person can recognize patterns, feel regret, or even experience genuine longing and still not have the capacity or readiness to behave differently when faced with intimacy again. Insight without emotional endurance rarely leads to lasting change. This is why the story often remains internally active for them, but externally unchanged. They may understand more, feel more, and even value more in hindsight, yet still struggle when real emotional closeness is reintroduced. That gap between awareness and action is where most of the repetition in relational patterns continues. From your side, the deeper shift happens when you stop measuring your emotional worth through someone else's delayed realization. Waiting for clarity from a person who only sees clearly in absence keeps you emotionally tied to uncertainty. But choosing silence as a boundary rather than a strategy changes the direction of your attention back toward yourself. It removes you from the cycle of overgiving, guessing, and hoping for reciprocal effort that never arrives consistently. In that sense, silence is not about creating a reaction in someone else, but about interrupting a pattern in yourself where love required persistence, proving, or emotional self-abandonment. There is also an important emotional truth that often gets overlooked. Meaningful connection is not defined by how deeply someone understands your value after you are gone, but by how consistently they are able to show up while you are present. Post-loss realization can feel validating, but it does not repair the experience of being unseen or emotionally alone within the relationship itself. And no amount of hindsight can replace the stability of mutual effort in real time. That distinction is what helps shift the focus away from what they will realize and toward what I actually experienced while I was there. Ultimately, the most transformative outcome of stepping back is not that it forces someone else into insight, but that it brings you back into alignment with emotional reciprocity. It makes space for relationships where effort is not one-sided, where presence is not conditional, and where connection does not depend on absence to be understood. Whether or not the other person reflects, regrets, or returns becomes secondary to the fact that you are no longer available in dynamics that require you to diminish yourself to maintain connection. And that is where emotional clarity becomes real, not in what someone else finally understands, but in what you are no longer willing to repeat.